whatever it takes to retain power.
Trump is an autocrat, and when an autocrat tells you what he is and what he's going to do, we should believe him. Good afternoon, and welcome to The Count, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is my co-host, Alana Sivan. And it is Thursday. You're almost done with your week, kind of, October 22nd, and there are 12 days left before voting is over. I'm phrasing it that way on purpose because it's not 12 days until the election. The election is happening right now. It's happening all around us. It's happening in many states. It's in full swing. More than 45 million ballots have already been cast. So that's actually more than a third of the total vote we saw in 2016. A number of states have now crossed the 50% threshold, where they've already seen 50% as many votes as they had in the entire 2016 election. Texas has now hit 2/3 of the 2016 total. We are looking at some really impressive potential turnout numbers. I'm going to save that as a treat for the end of the show. I will reveal at the end of the show some interesting projections on total turnout. But right now we want to focus on the election, because this is, of course, a show that is about the election, but more than that, it's about how our electoral process could be subverted or co-opted in order to set aside the will of the people and claim an illegitimate second term of minority rule for Donald Trump.
So normally we do a little bit more of an intro for our guests, but Leah, you weren't here yesterday, but you may have heard that we were already hyping you up because we're so excited to have you today. Leah Littman is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Michigan School of Law. She's also a co-host and creator of Strict Scrutiny, a podcast about the U.S. Supreme Court, and a writer who I'm sure you've seen her work in the Washington Post, New York Times, and Slate. Leah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's get right into it, because you're actually joining us at a perfect time. It seems like every day we've seen some new decision, legal challenge, controversy about how our elections are conducted and how those sorts of decisions are decided in the courts. And it's interesting because as these decisions are being made and these rulings are being handed out, we see that many people have already cast their votes. And so maybe the best place to start out today is to talk about the sorts of voting and election issues that have been brought and are still being brought before the courts this year. And then once you give us that overview, we'll then ask you to give us an update on any major outstanding court cases that are still in the pipeline and waiting to be resolved.
Absolutely. I think it's most helpful to think about the kinds of cases that we've already seen about this election as falling really under two categories. The first category are suits that seek to make it easier to vote, to loosen some of the restrictions on voting, or to make it easier for clerks and states to count the votes that come in. The second category of suits are those that actually challenge state rules that make it easier to vote. So I'll just describe some examples of each. So in the first category of cases that seek to loosen some of the restrictions on voting, some litigants have sought to challenge some of the restrictions on voting in light of the coronavirus pandemic. So some states have restrictions on absentee voting or voting by mail, and some groups have challenged these restrictions on the ground that voting in person during the coronavirus pandemic poses a unique threat, such that these restrictions on absentee voting violate individuals' right to vote. There are cases like this coming out of Wisconsin or Alabama, as other cases are as well. Another example of this kind of suit seeking to loosen restrictions on voting would be the current case in Texas. So the governor of Texas adopted this last-minute change to the state's voting rules, essentially reducing the number of absentee ballot drop boxes in each county to one. So there's just one absentee ballot drop box per county. And some litigants challenged this restriction as unconstitutionally burdening their right to vote. So that's one category of cases where litigants are going to court seeking to make it easier to vote. But the second category of cases are other litigants going to court who are trying to make it harder to vote. So some states have taken the initiative to try to make it easier for clerks to count votes, allowing states to begin processing or counting votes before election day. And other states have expanded the deadline for counting absentee ballots such that they will count absentee ballots that are received even after election day. And the Donald Trump campaign, as well as the Republican National Committee, as well as local Republican parties, have filed lawsuits challenging these state and local rules that attempt to make it easier to vote. So that's the second kind of case that we've seen. Now, it's likely that there will be other kinds of cases that arise in the immediate lead up to and perhaps even the aftermath of the election. But I think that that really captures the two general categories of cases that we've seen thus far.
That's definitely been a theme in this show where we see that Democrats want to expand voting access and Republicans want to minimize it and suppress it. Are there any specific cases that we should be sort of looking out for in terms of how they could impact the elections?
A few cases come to mind. There is just now an application filed by the Republican Party in North Carolina seeking to prevent the local board of elections, who announced that they will, in fact, count ballots that are received after Election Day. So that's one case to watch. It is possible that the Supreme Court could put on hold the lower court decision that allowed the local board of elections to adopt that rule. Another case to watch is the Pennsylvania case that the Supreme Court essentially punted on. That case actually involves a decision from a state Supreme Court that said under state law, voters can have their votes counted if they are received 2 days after Election Day. 4 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Kavanaugh, would have stayed that ruling, perhaps on the ground that the state court's interpretation of state law was so wrong that it actually violated the federal constitution. And it's possible that that case could make its way back to the Supreme Court if and when Judge Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed by the Republican Senate in advance of Election Day. But there are also cases that we just don't know about yet. There might be challenges to voter signature requirements, challenges to possible recounts, and those are cases to watch. But unfortunately, we just don't know if and when they will arise.
Oh, no, I'm going to make you speculate about exactly that. You can't escape this. Because yesterday was it yesterday that we were forced to watch Dan Rather calling the election for Bush in 2000? I think that my sense of time is gone. But we all had to relive Bush v. Gore here, and I won't make you rehash the merits or lack of merits of that decision. But we've talked a lot on the show about, the possibility that the outcome of the election could be a judicial decision rather than a democratic decision. And I'm curious to get your thoughts about how the Supreme Court could end up getting involved in a controversy arising from the presidential election. Trump, of course, has stated all sorts of things repeatedly relating to this. I think the one that comes to my mind is that he'll be asking the court to look at the ballots, for example. So how could the ballots or other issues around a contested election come before a Supreme Court, and who would, do you think, be on that Supreme Court?
Yeah, so I can imagine a few different cases that could make their way to the Supreme Court. One would be a redux of Bush versus Gore, where there's some uncertainty about the number of ballots that were validly cast. There might be questions about whether signatures, correctly match the signature that's available on state databases. There might be questions about whether, an automatic count properly tabulated the votes, as there was in Florida. And so those challenges might arise and make their way to the Supreme Court. And the question would essentially be some version of Bush versus Gore, namely, are the state's election law procedures for the count or recount in compliance with state law and in compliance with the Constitution? It is very likely that that question, if it goes to the Supreme Court, would be resolved by a court with a Justice Amy Coney Barrett on it. The Republican Senate appears likely to confirm her before the election. And so it's possible that, this election or these cases that could decide the election will be resolved by a court with 3 Trump appointees on it. I think it's also possible that we could see cases where the president or local Republican parties attempt to challenge the counting of ballots that are received after Election Day, or even challenge the continued counting after Election Day. We've already seen the Attorney General, Bill Barr, as well as the president laying the groundwork for questioning the validity of states continuing to count and determine the results after Election Day, even though in a lot of states they aren't permitted to begin counting ballots until Election Day itself. And it's really hard to process that, number of ballots in a single day. So those are two possibilities about the kinds of cases that might make their way to the court around Election Day or after. It's also possible that there might be, something's happening at polling locations the day of an election, and we could see litigation challenging, any burdens or restrictions that arise on Election Day. And it's possible that those could make their way to the court as well.
So I have two follow-ups for you. And one is going to involve kind of digging a little deeper on Pennsylvania. But first, you just mentioned stopping the count. This show is called The Count. I feel obligated to immediately seize upon this. We've talked a lot about the safe harbor deadline of December 8th. And I guess what I'm having trouble wrapping my head around is like, if there's a safe harbor deadline established by law, which is the deadline by which, all of the votes have to be counted sufficient to start thinking about who the electors will be. What argument could be made that votes should not be counted in the days and weeks prior to the legally established deadline for vote counting?
Sure. So the arguments that Republicans have made fall under a few categories. The first argument we saw in the Pennsylvania case, which is their argument is that under a federal statute, Congress made Election Day, not the days after Election Day. So if you are continuing to count votes, you are, prolonging the election post-Election day. Now that argument is ludicrous. It also
renders the safe harbor deadline meaningless. And I thought there was like a statutory interpretation thing where you have to assume everything has meaning.
Yes, no, that's correct. And that's part of why, frankly, I was so taken aback by the fact that 4 conservative justices agreed with either that argument in the Pennsylvania Republican legislature's stay application, or the second argument, which is in some ways even more striking, which is that the state court got state law so wrong that they were usurping the state legislature's ability to establish the laws regarding the election, which is required under the Constitution. Either argument is pretty absurd, but I just wanted to flag the first one because it's very possible that we right now have 4 justices on the Supreme Court who are sympathetic to the idea that federal law requires there to be a singular election day such that any votes tabulated or received after Election Day are somehow, uniquely or presumptively problematic.
Okay, I'm going to pause here on that because we are getting super wonky. We were so excited. We were literally talking about how excited we were with this conversation yesterday. So we're definitely geeking out right now. But for viewers, the statutory interpretation thing, I don't remember much of law school. It's one of the most basic thing baby lawyers learn is that if there's a law, generally all parts of that law have a meaning, and you have to assume that there's no meaningless things included in the law. And so you're basically saying we got 4 justices on the Supreme Court who are ready to say that all of the elections where we've counted votes after Election Day were wrong and unconstitutional, and that the whole Electoral Count Act is just meaningless. That's pretty, that's way out there. That's not a borderline call.
It is way out there. And in addition to this idea that you mentioned, which is we should give this statutory safe harbor under which states have until December to certify the results of an election, we should give that provision meaning. Another very common principle of statutory interpretation, any interpretation of laws, is that you should avoid absurd consequences. And under this theory, think about military service members who are abroad. When they go to vote on Election Day, their ballot is not going to be received on Election Day. It cannot be counted until after Election Day. And so this interpretation under which all ballots that are counted or received after Election Day are uniquely suspect is just not something that we should embrace as a constitutional democracy if we do in fact want everyone's votes to be counted if they vote on or before Election Day.
Okay, so last piece of this, and then I'm going to just sit here and sit with this and soak in it for a minute. You mentioned the second argument was that the state Supreme Court was so wrong about their own state's law that their wrongness violated the federal Constitution. Is that something that, How often are states that wrong? Is that a frequent outcome that you see on the court, or is this also sort of wildly unusual?
This is wildly unusual, and it's part of why Bush versus Gore was so striking and so unsettling to so many members of the legal community, because it is just a fundamental principle in our legal system that states get the final say on issues of state law. It's for state courts to determine what their state law means, not for the federal courts to do. And so the idea that the US Supreme Court knows better than the Pennsylvania Supreme Court what Pennsylvania state law says is a little odd. And the idea that the Pennsylvania state court will be so wrong about Pennsylvania state law that it would violate the federal constitution is even odder still.
You know, it makes me think about the lengths that one party is going to sort of entrench their agenda, which is something you've done a lot of work on, and something that we've talked a lot on this show. When I say you've done a lot of work on, I don't mean that you yourself are trying to entrench.
Stop entrenching your agenda.
Thank you for clarifying that.
You do not have a bad agenda. I mean that you have done a lot of work on examining the way that the GOP has tried to advance their agenda through the courts. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that, and also ask for you to help us put this all into context. So talk to us a little bit about how the Republican Party throughout the years has worked to advance their conservative agenda through the courts.
Yeah, so you can think about examples just over the last 4 years. So President Trump, when he was initially elected, promised to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. And they tried to do so in Congress. Turns out, however, the Affordable Care Act is very popular, and they did not have the Democratic will and popular support to actually repeal the Affordable Care Act. We all remember the memorable moment in which Senator John McCain, walked up to the dais and right, exactly, gave a thumbs down on Affordable Care Act reform. So, they lack the Democratic will to accomplish Affordable Care Act repeal in the democratic process. What do they do next? They go to the courts, and they are right now asking the Supreme Court to invalidate the entire Affordable Care Act, and essentially to do what they, again, lacked the democratic bona fides to do in the political process itself. Similarly, they don't have the popular support to restrict abortion. Overturning Roe versus Wade is extremely unpopular. They also lack democratic support for restricting LGBT rights and reducing LGBT equality. So they're turning to the courts to do so. And I think the most dramatic example of this is how they are trying to entrench their ability to hold political power through the courts, again, because they lack the democratic mandate to pursue their agendas in the political process. That's why you have the president hoping that the courts will decide the election in his favor. That's why you have the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign seeking to prevent state election boards from counting ballots that are received after Election Day. They would like to make it harder to vote, to reduce the number of votes that are counted, to make it easier for themselves to win. And they are relying on the courts to advance that agenda and secure, minority political rule.
And when you say relying on the courts, I mean, these aren't courts that Republicans haven't had a shape in developing. Talk to us a little bit about that, particularly with how the Republicans have sort of leaned a little bit on the Federalist Society.
Leaned a little bit on.
I'm kind of, leaned a lot of bit on.
So Republicans have placed a premium on controlling the federal courts for the last several decades. President Trump has already appointed over 50 nominees to the influential courts of appeals, where the vast majority of cases in the federal system will be resolved. By way of comparison, President Obama confirmed just over 50 nominees to the courts of appeals in 8 years. And it's no accident that he wasn't able to get many of his nominees through. For the final 2 years of his presidency, Senator Mitch McConnell refused to advance any of the Court of Appeals nominees that President Obama had selected, hoping to hold open those vacancies for a Republican president to fill, again, knowing that they were relying on the federal courts to advance their agenda, just like he held open the seat that arose on the Supreme Court after Justice Scalia passed away. He held open so many seats in the federal courts of appeals and the lower federal courts for a Republican president to fill. As you were suggesting, this administration has relied on conservative legal networks like the Federalist Society or the Judicial Crisis / Confirmation Network. I always forget what they are called now, in order to identify candidates who, in their view, will vote in ways that are consistent with their substantive agenda. That's one of the reasons why that movement gets so irate, the very few times when their nominees actually differ or depart from their views in major cases. They got extremely angry when Justice Gorsuch and the Chief Justice voted in the Title VII case to say that Title VII prohibits firing workers on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. It's why they're so livid with the chief for not voting with them in the DACA case or the abortion case. They expect their nominees to vote in lockstep with their substantive views. And for the most part, they do. And that's why they place such a premium on controlling the federal courts.
Doesn't sound like calling balls and strikes to me.
Not exactly.
So this is kind of a perfect moment as we talk about lockstep judges who have pre-committed to an organizational agenda that contravenes the will of the people. Which, when you say it, really doesn't sound like who we want America to be. But since we're talking about this, and since there's been this very active, really interesting conversation happening nationally on expanding the court. And we have some interesting sort of big news that dropped this morning regarding Joe Biden's stance on expanding the court. Can we play that quick clip of Biden from his CBS News interview?
If elected, what I will do is I'll put together a national commission bipartisan commission of scholars, constitutional scholars, Democrats, Republicans, liberal, conservative. And I will ask them to, over 180 days, come back to me with recommendations as to how to reform the court system, because it's getting out of whack. The way in which it's being handled. And it's not about court packing. There's a number of other things that our constitutional scholars have debated, and I'd look to see what recommendations that commission might make.
Okay, so that was a lovely dodge. He didn't really have to say whether he'd pack the courts, a phrase why are we calling it that? Anyway, it avoids him committing to anything, but it is an interesting open door. And I wanted to ask you a couple of things related to this. First of all, apart from just purely expanding the size of the Supreme Court, what other sorts of Supreme Court reforms could a hypothetical commission of the kind that Biden describes change the way the court functions, and how would they do it?
One possible set of reforms is what's called jurisdiction stripping, which is essentially you remove certain cases from the US Supreme Court or possibly the federal courts as well. So you might enact, for example, a Green New Deal and say no court can decide any constitutional challenges to the Green New Deal. Or you might enact a statute that says no court can determine or no court can adjudicate any cases involving Second Amendment constitutional challenges. So they can't strike down, gun regulations. So those are some possibilities about what jurisdiction stripping legislation might entail. Another possible set of reforms is what's called term limits. So instead of Supreme Court justices being appointed for life, they're instead appointed for a finite term of 18 or so years. So when a vacancy on the Supreme Court will arise. There are also a host of other proposals, but those are kind of the main ones that are discussed.
I'm going to admit my ignorance. I'd never heard of jurisdiction stripping. Would that actually, why wouldn't the very fact of their having stripped jurisdiction not go to the Supreme Court and then get overturned? That's the Hall of Mirrors.
So it's a risk that the Supreme Court would say that a statute limiting their jurisdiction is unconstitutional. On the other hand, there is a well-established body of law that says Congress has the power to alter both the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction to review cases from the lower federal courts and state courts, and the jurisdiction of the lower federal courts. In a famous Civil War era decision, Ex parte McCardle, the court upheld as constitutional Congress's removal of the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction to hear constitutional challenges involving habeas petitions. There, the case was challenging the entirety of Reconstruction. And the court said, look, Congress has the power to alter our appellate jurisdiction, and it's not up to us to ask why they did so.
That is fascinating. I did not know that, and I'm intrigued. And I don't know if the decorum of that court would be repeated by our current lineup, but
It's possible, although John Roberts, when he was an assistant attorney general in the Reagan Department of Justice, authored a memo defending the constitutionality of proposals to strip the Supreme Court's jurisdiction and federal court's jurisdiction of cases involving school prayer and desegregation.
I guess each side has the thing they want to never have adjudicated by anyone or looked at or thought about too much.
Yep.
Scary path. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you an uncomfortable personal question now. What are your personal thoughts on expanding the court? Is it a good idea? Is it a never-ending escalation? Will we end up with 1 million Supreme Court justices?
I think at a minimum, Supreme Court expansion should be on the table. I think doing nothing would be to ratify the asymmetrical Republican hardball and takeover of the courts. And so worrying about the prospect of escalation is in a lot of ways ignoring that we're already in that world today. And Republicans have been escalating the fight for years. Republicans essentially altered the size of the court back in 2016 when they refused to consider President Obama's nomination to fill the vacancy, that was created by Justice Scalia's passing. So I think the possibility of Supreme Court reform is very serious and should be taken very seriously. And frankly, the Pennsylvania decision probably pushed me closer to Supreme Court expansion, again, just given how out there that decision was, possibly invalidating a state court decision that just was interpreting state election law in a way that made it easier to vote. And all of these decisions in the Supreme Court and the federal courts of appeals by Republican-controlled courts, making it more difficult to vote and invalidating state and local efforts to make it easier to vote, are, I think, an embarrassment to a constitutional democracy and need to be addressed as part of any democratic reform.
Thank you for that.
So that was a great way to spring folks to action, I think, and to make them realize the urgency of the potential need to expand the court, or the absolute need to expand the court, let's be real. But something we really love to do on this show is scare our viewers. And
It's almost Halloween.
Yes, it is almost Halloween. And we love our viewers and also love to scare the bejesus out of them. So we will ask you to help us do that. So particularly, I'd like to ask you if you could take us through what another 4 years of Trump could look like for democracy and elections and fairness in elections in the future.
So I will focus on what I know best, which is what the courts with another 4 years of Trump might do to our constitutional democracy. It is very possible that we will see the further weakening, if not invalidation, of the Voting Rights Act. Although the Supreme Court invalidated a major provision of the Voting Rights Act back in 2013, there still remains Section 2, which prohibits states from adopting election laws or policies that result in a disproportionate effect on voters of color. The Supreme Court is set to hear a case from Arizona that challenges an Arizona law that prohibits people who aren't the voter from returning an absentee ballot. And it's possible that the Supreme Court will weaken Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act so that it is essentially impossible to prove that a voting law or policy has a disproportionately adverse effect on voters of color. It is also possible that the Supreme Court would someday in the next 4 years, with 4 more years of the Trump presidency, declare Section 2 itself unconstitutional as exceeding Congress's powers under the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment. That's a scary possibility. It's also possible that the court would allow states and possibly the federal government to draw state legislative districts and apportion federal congressional representatives on the basis of an apportionment that excludes non-citizens. If you do that, that will make it easier for Republicans to maintain control at the state legislative level. It will also reduce the representation of more diverse states in Congress and also reduce their access to federal funds. On top of that, we will also see the court making it harder to prove that states are engaged in what is called racial gerrymandering, drawing legislative districts in a way that dilutes the power of voters of color. We've seen the court, in Abbott versus Perez, most recently a case out of Texas, but we'll see other decisions as well. Again, making it harder and harder for litigants to prove that state election laws were drawn in a way to disadvantage voters of color. The other example I would give is back when Justice Kennedy was still on the court, Justice Ginsburg authored a decision that allowed states to adopt what are called independent redistricting commissions, to take the power to draw state legislative districts out of the hands of self-interested legislators who often draw legislative districts in order to make it easier for themselves to maintain power and make it harder for voters to vote them out. And Justice Ginsburg said the voters of a state can assign the responsibility of drawing legislative districts to independent redistricting commissions, not self-interested legislators who want to keep themselves in power. That decision was 5-4. The 5 justices in the majority were Justice Ginsburg and Justice Kennedy, who are no longer on the court, Justice Breyer, Justice Sotomayor, and Justice Kagan. All of the conservatives were in dissent, and it is extremely likely that Justice Kavanaugh, who replaced Justice Kennedy, and Justice Barrett, when she replaces Justice Ginsburg, think that decision is incorrectly decided and will further hamstring states' ability to make their elections more democratic.
And I think what's particularly scary is that this is something that could happen. All of these things that are things that could happen even if Trump doesn't win.
Yes.
Given the makeup of our Supreme Court. Which is why all of those things that you were saying are absolutely necessary, because it will balance that out. They'll balance that out. My last question for you is about Trump's ability to use the courts in the case of a contested or close election, and how he'd be able to do that. What are the consequences of him doing that, particularly with this Supreme Court? And how can folks work against that?
We started discussing the possible cases that the Trump campaign or Trump administration might bring, trying to challenge state recounts, trying to challenge states' ability to count ballots that are received after Election Day. And in the event of a close election, and even a close election in states who could determine the outcome of an election. So even if it's a popular vote, blowout, but there are a few states that will decide the outcome of an election, he could take those cases to the Supreme Court. The way to prevent that is to ensure that it is a blowout election. It is nowhere close, and it's nowhere close in the states that will decide the election. That includes Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, Texas, Georgia. I mean, you name it. There needs to be massive voter turnout in all of the states to ensure that our election isn't decided in a decidedly undemocratic way.
And ideally, as far before election as possible, since we might be living in a world where election day is a day in a pandemic, with people voting from all over the world and also inside their homes. So if that doesn't light a fire under your butt to go vote, I don't know what will. Professor Lippman, thank you so very, very, very much for joining us. This was the most fun half hour I've had in a really long time, even though all of our subject matter was basically apocalyptic, which is amazing that something so terrifying could be so fun. I hope you will come back and join us again on this show very, very soon. Definitely. Thank you for having me. Take care. Alana. I think so this is the thing that I'm carrying away from this, beyond all of the sort of urgent need for a crushing voter turnout well before the election, and also the terror of what lies ahead in terms of the Supreme Court. But it's really interesting to me that the Pennsylvania case is essentially an attack on states' rights. Because you've got the Supreme Court, the federal government, where I'm from is what you might call it, telling states what they can and cannot do and how they can interpret their own laws and what their constitution means, and really rummaging around in the attic of Pennsylvania and being pretty bossy. And that is surprising to me, because the world I grew up in was a world in which states' rights generally meant more conservative policy, and where the federal government was constantly trying to subvert states' rights to do incredibly regressive things. I mean, just the phrase states' rights brings Confederate flags to mind. So it's really interesting to me that we are seeing this historical twist where states' rights could now become a bastion of inclusion and democracy getting quashed by an incredibly authoritarian federal government.
I mean, to me, it's all consistent with the theme that we've had here, which is we follow certain mores and principles when they serve our interests. So, for example, I think about, even the Senate Judiciary Committee meeting today, where there are rules for that committee. They were not followed, and they said, okay, we're still going to go ahead and have a vote with the whole Senate.
Break that down for a second, because since that news just happened this morning, I don't know if everybody watching is aware of how they broke the rules.
Right. Okay. So I'm no Leah, so I probably wouldn't be able to explain it as well as she can, but I will do my best. So basically, there are committee rules. So there are several committees in the Senate that have jurisdiction over different issues. Jurisdiction isn't the right word, but sort of they deal with specific issues. There is the Judiciary Committee, which it is their job to sort of be the leaders when it comes to issues having to do with the judiciary. Their rules for that committee state that there need to be at least some Democrats there during their votes. And there has to be a vote in that committee before it goes to the entire Senate. Those rules were not followed in committee because all the Democrats said we're not showing up. Nevertheless, Republicans said, rule schmools, I don't really care. We're just going to move it straight on to the whole Senate to go for a vote. And this was about Amy Coney Barrett. I should have said that up front. But it all goes
like
to
some minor swept under the rug thing. Right.
I just sort of figure we're all thinking about that right now. But yeah, so basically they're pushing her nomination through before the election. That way she will be there to decide election issues for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me because I think there have been all sorts of times where the Republicans have said we don't really care about rules, but I've also said we don't even care about our own rules. And it's funny to think about this concept of, I'm not going to call it court packing because you're right. I don't think that's the right term. I think the right term is
what's been happening under Trump is court packing. They have been packing the courts with Federalist Society people. What we're talking about is court rebalancing. Exactly.
Because what we've had for years and years and years from Obama, from the Senate Republicans and Obama, is this effort to completely imbalance the courts, to say goodbye to norms, say goodbye to civility. That's another thing that comes up here. And now that the issue of balancing that out is coming up in this election, Republicans act like it's completely outlandish. I mean, we've heard the debates where the Republican candidates are saying, how dare you pack the courts? Nobody wants that. That's ridiculous. Like, no, it's not ridiculous. It's bringing equilibrium to the system that has for far too long been slanted in favor of Republicans.
Someone pointed out to me recently that complaining about hypocrisy just has no purpose because it increases the satisfaction of the hypocrite, right? If what they think they're doing is owning the libs by not following their own rules, pointing out that they're not following their own rules is not going to make them feel bad. But the rule following to me, that's really this puts me in mind of the fact that there are so many rules that have no consequences attached to them, right? The rule isn't what matters, we've learned. The rule gets lit on fire and tossed out the window. What matters is the consequence, the enforcement of that rule. If a committee vote without a minority party member present resulted in an invalidation of that vote by the rules, that would be a real different world than a world in which they can say, well, we broke the rules, but it doesn't matter. Here's your new justice. I mean,
there's no incentive now for, if there's a world where Democrats control the Senate, to follow those rules. Maybe if Republicans played nice every now and then, they would. And they'd say hey, let's make it so rules have consequences.
They don't like breaking the rules.
I know.
They're not used to it.
Well, they better get used to it.
Oh man. Speaking of normalizing things, Alana and I are out here. What were you going to say?
No, I'm excited. I'm just expressing excitement for the next.
All right. So Alana and I here are we're out here normalizing, playing to win, fighting like it's a street fight, not a fencing match. But we've had opportunity to reflect recently on some of the norms that are being erased for voters. And Alana, I want you to introduce this segment. I realized that I just wandered in and
No, I just got so excited.
Please take it from here.
Well, normally we'd be doing poll time, which we also get very excited for. But unfortunately, we don't have poll time today. We will have new polls for you very soon, but not today. We miss Jason as always, but no polls. But instead, we have something really exciting, and it is going to be really illustrative of the differences between good voting versus bad voting. Well, good voting systems versus bad voting systems.
Good experiences. Good voting experiences.
So Emily, tell us about it.
So, okay. I wanted to show you what my voting experience was like for a couple of reasons. I had been really on the fence about sharing this because, as you will see, my voting experience was very, very positive, and really easy. And I was on the fence because it's contrasted with 8-hour lines in places across the country. But what I realized, the more I thought about this, I took a little cute selfie video for y'all that we'll get to watch in a minute. The more I thought about my experience, the more I realized what I experienced was normal. And most Americans are being gaslit into thinking that a wildly unpleasant, hazard-filled voting experience is somehow normal or necessary or the only possible option. So I'd love for y'all to share in my voting experience. Let's see the tape. Hey, so I'm headed out to vote today, and I think what we're going to see here is going to be a very different experience than what we've seen in Texas and Ohio and states that have engaged in robust voter suppression practices. I'm in a small town in Massachusetts, so I expect to see a polling place that's not featuring an 8-hour line. But I wanted to film going to vote today because for those of you who are lucky enough to be in places where it is easy to vote, I wanted to just give everyone a tour of a safe and sanitary voting experience. And if anything, I hope this will serve to compare and contrast with what people are experiencing in Texas, in Ohio, what people are likely to experience in Pennsylvania and Florida, because I think that the voter suppression we've seen around the country becomes even more appalling when you compare it with an experience like this. So here we go. Okay, we're headed to the polling place. It is 40 minutes after they opened. I am hoping we haven't made a tragic error, but it's really rainy, so I don't know, maybe the lines won't be too bad. We're here, there are people here. I have my vote pin ready to go in case they don't have a sticker for me. We're headed in. We're here, not too many people, looking good. Got the kid, headed in. We got the sample ballot right here. We're taking a look before we go in. We may have studied for this exam before we got here. Do you notice anything notable?
I don't know where Kanye is. I don't know what I'm gonna do.
So we have a very clear sign that's probably not gonna let me film the actual event itself, but I will say, looking in there, it's looking really, really safe and really easy and really clean. And I, for one, can't wait. I got permission to show y'all that I'm here with my ballot, and it's clean. They just sanitized my space. I got a sanitized pen. It's all feeling hospital clean. I just thought this was a really cute instructional, and I wanted to share it with you because the person who thinks that the best vocal artist is a poorly marked Janis Joplin is my favorite person. It's worth noting that this is early voting, so we're actually filling out an absentee ballot and putting it in a box. Got to properly fill out everything, double check it 3 times. Y'all, we're not even all using the same pens. I'm dropping my pen in the used pens box so that voters don't have to feel like it's yucky to touch the pen. And we are dropping it in the box. That was early voting. The whole thing took 5 minutes, in and out. Felt very safe, sanitized 16 times, and we are on our way home. Well, there you go.
I have to say, I have a confession to make. The reason I was so excited, while voting is really excited, I was more just excited to see her adorable child.
Oh, thank you. She's actually she's an experienced voter. She's been to vote a couple of times. She knows the drill. I would also like to note that there's a lot of white privilege in this video, right? I'm just gonna walk right in here, and I know you have a sign that says I can't take a cell phone video, but I'm just gonna ask and maybe do it anyway, and just break all these rules. And I think that there's a lot about my voting experience that's not necessarily representative of everybody's voting experience. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, which is like, voting does not look like this in most places for most people, especially not big cities, especially not more diverse jurisdictions, especially not, blue cities and red states. But it should. This is normal. Having voting take 10 minutes and be clean and safe and painless. And having like people there who, if I was confused, would have happily explained things to me about how to fill out the ballot properly. People who were, making sure that everything was running well and that it was a friendly, safe environment. People who would, make sure that there weren't any intimidating mobs standing in front of the polling place. Like all of this is normal. That's what voting should look like. We are getting so used to like all of these different forms of suppression, right? The protesters outside, the fake military guys outside, the long lines, needing to bring people water because the lines are so long that they have to wait all day and they might get dehydrated. Not having your ballot get counted because no one explained to you how to fill it out properly, not being able to feel safe in a polling place where nobody's wearing a mask and it's all closed in and everybody's packed together. There have been so many things that we've been told not to normalize as a people over the last 4 years. And I think not normalizing voter suppression is really, really important. And I wanted everybody to see that video so that we can recall that that is what we are all entitled to. And if you have a government that cares about its people and cares about their right to vote safely and efficiently, they would have enough polling places and enough poll workers where everybody could have an experience like that. It was my first time voting there. And we were displaced because of the pandemic. And I just feel like, it should always be that easy.
It's funny, even where I am, I'm in New York. It's a diverse, big city, not a Republican leaning city at all. And it's been sort of a mixed bag. Like some years it's kind of in and out, but there have been in the past year, I think I've waited on some long lines. And I don't think it's always a result of, obviously in many of the things we've discussed on this show, it's often a result of intentional voter suppression within the state. But also a lot of it has to do with the fact that voting is difficult, voting is complicated, it's a infrastructural, sometimes nightmare. But something to note too is that Republicans have not been helpful, particularly Trump Republicans have not been helpful in trying to mitigate those concerns. So for example, over the summer, Senate Republicans fought to exclude a $3.6 billion in the COVID relief package to help state and local officials run elections, particularly in this very difficult year. So right now in New York, for example, we've got some really hardworking Board of Elections here, but there's a lot that needs to be done. And in such a short amount of time, that's going to make it really difficult in a lot of elections around the country in different states. And I think something that's important to note is that we need to have our state officials be willing to sort of do everything that they can to sort of make up the loss that's going to happen so that every single voting location looks like yours.
Yeah. Well, let's keep in mind, like, for every point we make, there is a Trump quote. And in March, during the legislative period you just referred to, Trump went on Fox and Friends, and the quote was, I'm reading from my computer, they had things, levels of voting, that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again. It's like this overt admission that you are bringing a policy package so disliked by the American people that if you let them all vote, they will never let you do the things you want to do. That is not democratic. Little d democratic, right?
And this quote is in response to measures to make it easier to vote. So basically what he's saying is, if people can vote, I'm not going to win. People don't like our party.
People don't like our ideas. They don't like our party. They don't like our ideas. They don't like our beliefs or our policy. So we should just not let them vote, or just make it really, really hard and unpleasant, and ensure that we have judges in place who will do completely unprecedented things to let us get away with it.
It's exact, and it goes back to autocracy.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's I am leader. I have best ideas. You people you don't know. I know, you don't.
I like the grammar you use there. It's also kind of seems appropriate. I
tried to make it Trumpian.
Be best ideas, Alana. Be best ideas. Sorry.
My ideas are very good.
So, all right. Today we're going to run through more ways in which Republicans and, Trump allies have been essentially gaslighting Americans into believing that voting somehow needs to be complicated or difficult or painful. That there's no other way to do this. This is just how voting works. It has to be remarkably unpleasant and result in silencing most of the electorate. So it's a huge problem. It's gaslighting. It is a lie. It is an ongoing lie that everyone is being told on a daily basis. When I say everyone, I mean more than 500,000 eligible voters failed to vote in 2016 because of problems associated with the management of polling places. I mean, long waits. I mean, these are estimates from the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we can trace our way. I think it's worth it to do a little walk up through history, very recent history, to how we got here. We can start with the 2013 Supreme Court decision that Leah mentioned, which weakened the 1965 Voting Rights Act provisions against voter discrimination. Basically, in 2013, the court decided that areas with a documented history of voting discrimination, so like those that had required Black or Hispanic voters to pay a poll tax or pass a literacy test, they were previously forced to convince the Department of Justice that their changes, their policies were not more of that, right? They had to convince the overseeing official that the election changes they wanted to make would not have a discriminatory effect. The Supreme Court was like, nope, y'all are good. You've been doing it long enough. It's fine. We trust you. We trust you. Historically discriminatory jurisdictions, do what you will. So taking out that requirement that these jurisdictions prove that their policies aren't discriminatory unleashed an astonishing amount of suppression. So 6 years later, 2019, there's a new study by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which found that states across the American South, so a lot of these jurisdictions that were subject to these Voting Rights Act requirements, they closed nearly 1,200 polling places in the wake of that decision. That decision was the freedom they needed to just create the voter suppression and the problems that we are seeing today. In Texas, that meant that election officials closed more than 1 in 10 voting locations statewide. In Arizona, more than 1 in 5. Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, they all closed roughly 1 in 20 polling locations. And so what does that do? When the Voting Rights Act had teeth in this way, they would have had to prove that those changes didn't disproportionately impact voters of color and historically marginalized voters. Well, now that they don't have to meet that obligation, these changes disproportionately impact voters of color and urban voters and Democratic voters. MIT actually surveyed voters in the 2016 election. And this MIT survey showed that white voters had voting experiences like mine. They just waited 10 minutes to vote, but Black voters were nearly waiting a time and a half as long. And Latino voters were experiencing the same thing. So also because people of color tend to live in population centers and in more urban areas, these super long waits of multiple hours really pull those averages up. In other words, one 2013 Supreme Court decision resulted in one election that had a ton of suppression. And now what we're seeing, which is completely unprecedented, and that is what they are trying to normalize. The unprecedented, very recent levels of voter suppression that they are gaslighting you and telling you are necessary just because turnout is high.
And it's the closing of polling locations is probably one of the worst things that can happen because it makes voting more difficult for, especially right now, people who have health issues. It also makes it more difficult for people with disabilities, which brings us to what this administration has been doing that is completely unprecedented, which is using the Department of Justice to bring suits on polling locations that are not ADA compliant. And then saying, you polling locations need to not fix your locations so that they become ADA compliant for people with disabilities, you need to close them down. And the thing is, that's not what anybody wants. People with disabilities don't want fewer polling locations. They want ramps. They want things that make it easier to access the locations. But in true form, the Trump administration has said, okay, well, here's a little kink we can use in the law, and let's manipulate it to serve our purposes. And that's exactly what they're doing right there. And also, I'm like jumping around a little bit, but I don't care. Going back to the Voting Rights Act too, I did this on the first episode, plugged an episode of Blackish that talked about this. And there's this great sort of timeline.
They're not paying you, but they should pay you.
Right. I mean, hi, Blackish. But there's this really great sort of illustration of it where Tracy Ellis Ross plays the Voting Rights Act. And she plays it from when it's first passed, and she goes on different talk shows and they interview the Voting Rights Act. And on every talk show, and it's like all time, so it's Ricky and Jerry Springer, all the different ones that are popular at the time. And she's all happy in each one. And then it comes to 2013. And she says, she's like leaning on this chair. She's like, I don't do anything anymore. I'm not useful anymore. Basically, they just gutted all my rights out of me and made it so that I can't even protect people anymore. And that's exactly what's happening. It's like we've regressed in years while the Supreme Court said in these places, hey, actually, we've come so far ahead that we don't need you anymore. And it's had the exact opposite effect of that, where we're going back in time in terms of providing voting rights.
Let's talk about those restrictions. Let's talk about the gross rules and the things they've done.
Right. I mean, you just talked about them, right?
Well, no, but like, poll workers and
those things. Yes. Okay.
all of this. I know you have the nitty gritty, and I'm gonna.
Right. Well, let's talk about the significant lack of investments in critical voting infrastructure. So polling places need poll workers to operate, and they have historically tended to be older volunteers, and COVID complicates these abilities to staff volunteers due to health concerns, obviously. And there are really strenuous requirements. Volunteers have to complete a training and commit to a 15-hour day at their assigned polling site as well, which, by the way, in some areas tend to change. And there are often strict service requirements imposed by state law. So I'm going to pull some of these up. Age restrictions, preventing people under the age of 18 from working in some states. And then also, although volunteers in most places get paid for their training and for the elections they work, it's not like it's a full-time job. People often have to take a day off of their real job to be trained in poll watching or to be poll workers. And also, during the 2016 election, nearly 65% of jurisdictions reported that it was very difficult or somewhat difficult to obtain sufficient numbers of poll workers. In 2018, the proportions of jurisdictions reporting difficulties with poll workers increased to nearly 70%. And so states could implement all sorts of policy changes to ensure that they have more poll workers who could operate more polling stations and serve more voters. And for one, lots of people are unemployed right now due to the pandemic. So it's easy to see how a state could surge resources to get people paid work while dramatically increasing civic engagement and voting. I've seen a big push to do all of that where I live. But nationwide, that would really require lawmakers to want to make it easier to vote. And we've seen throughout the years, that's not something that they've wanted to do. And it's, to be honest, something that we've seen from both parties. And it's sort of this like unequal playing field where you have the GOP, who has been so adamant about restricting our rights to vote. And then you have a Democratic Party who wants to play by rules, and that's nice and good, but also isn't willing to sort of like go the extra mile to make sure that they're fighting against this systemic and long-term voter suppression tactics. And that's something that really needs to change.
And some of what you're talking about is I don't care who you vote for, or where you stand politically, or like if you are watching the show from anywhere where there's people out of work, you would probably like the idea of making poll working like a paid, legitimate job that people could get right now. Like everybody, no matter where they are, who they are, likes job creation. So the fact that there's paralysis from state legislatures on this just shows how much those suppression efforts have made really potentially like very popular investments in the community a third rail that people won't touch. And if you're watching and you wish you could have a job that paid you right now to work the election, like you should be mad at your state legislature for engaging in the paralysis created around voting. Speaking of that paralysis, it totally goes beyond personnel. So in 2018, 41 states were using voting equipment that was at least 10 years old. Mm-hmm. That's like tech that's 10 years old. I think weren't phones from 10 years ago like the kind that come in a bag and attached to your car? Like tech has to be updated. If it's not updated, it's not secure. It's prone to breaking. If we can't invest in like,
I get slack for having an iPhone that's 3 years old. Like,
I still miss my Razor phone that flipped over.
Those are the best. The flip phones, love those.
But no, I mean, when you think about how like stupidly complicated it can be to fill out a ballot design, instructions. Think about how many millions of dollars are invested in like, you know, the sort of corporate design that makes buying something online really easy, or makes filling out a form at a store like to get on their mailing list really easy, really intuitive. We don't invest that way in ballot design, in instructions, in voter education. You know, this creates problems at the polls where people get confused and they take longer to vote and the lines get longer. And there's tens of thousands of votes lost in every election, according to the Brennan Center, because people weren't able to figure out the stupid, badly graphic designed ballots. I mean, this, of course, again, disproportionately impacts low-income voters, new voters, and elderly voters, all people that all of these efforts are targeting. And there is no excuse for this. This is the most basic function of our form of government, is like letting you, the people, have a say in who's driving this crazy train. If we're not willing to invest in this and make it safe and reliable and leave it just like, if we're willing to leave it totally open to interference in the way that we have, when it's so possible to make it simple and easy for everyone to partake in democracy, we've really just failed. I mean, we live in a world where corporate interests have proven that it could be really simple and easy to do this, and we are unwilling to utilize their methodology in service of our own national well-being.
You know, and I think the other thing too that's sort of like an intricate point to get is that the failure across party lines to invest in essential infrastructure ends up just playing into the GOP and Trump's motives to sort of sow confusion upon the whole election process, right? Like, because when there are lots of ballots that are sort of not counted because of technical difficulties and that sort of thing, that sort of makes Trump say, oh, you can't trust any of this. You just can't trust it. You can trust it. It's going to take a long time. And we need to make the proper efforts to ensure that our elected officials put the right investments into our voting systems. But it doesn't mean that the election is fraudulent. Let's always remember that. And that being said,
it actually makes it less fraudulent.
Exactly. And let me just end with sort of a big overarching point. In many counties and countries, Election Day is a national holiday. Not only is it a national holiday, but predictable complications we just described make it necessary for people to make a plan. Not having it as a national holiday makes it necessary for us to make a plan. And I'm urging voters to do that today. Make a plan, know exactly when you're going to vote, know what time you're going to vote, know your voting location, because otherwise it could be there could be sorts of complications.
Go early. You don't have to take a Tuesday off from work.
I'm going Saturday.
Yeah, I went last Saturday.
I know.
Okay, so I would also just like to add, there's so many nice things you can do for people who are standing in line experiencing voter suppression. Entertain them, bring them water.
I'm going to bring Heads Up.
Yeah.
You know that game? It's like charades. You put it on your phone while we're masks, and from a distance we can play Heads Up.
Yeah, I don't know if like the pandemic protocol would make people comfortable like accepting pizza while waiting online, but I'm going to find out. Okay, so we promised you at the top that we would have some nice little tidbits about turnout for you if you stuck with us through this whole hour plus. So we have some new numbers from Nate Silver, and I'm going to read them to you. It looks like, according to 538's estimates, they are projecting a total turnout in this presidential race of 154 million people. Now, to compare that to 2016, in 2016, the turnout was only 137 million people, which means that we are talking, we might, if y'all keep this up, we could hit 60% turnout, which would be a first since the 26th Amendment was passed. I will end on a lovely anecdote relating back to this in terms of people not letting any of these tactics work and standing up for their rights and standing in those lines and not being deterred. So Chris Hollins, the clerk of Harris County, Texas. As we've talked about Harris County so much. The size of Connecticut, it's huge. They have one ballot drop-off box for 4.7 million people.
Just one.
But Harris County is voting. Harris County is voting in record numbers. It is so moving to see. They are now closing in on 1 million early votes in a number that is just like blowing away 2016 numbers. It's just like blowing them out of the water. So Chris Hollins, who's the clerk of Harris County, recently speculated in an interview with USA Today that actually all of these GOP-led efforts at voter suppression are sparking a backlash and pissing people off and making them vote at higher rates and wait in longer lines. And this is exactly the kind of screw you response that I find most American and most satisfying. So if we close on anything, thank y'all for saying screw you to voter suppression and getting out there early and waiting in line. This has been another episode of The Count. We're really glad you joined us. We'll be back here tomorrow, 4 o'clock. We hope to see you again. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. This is Alana Sivan. We'll see you tomorrow.